Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is the second half of our lecture on westward expansion, specifically focusing on Native American resistance and ultimately removal. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your screen, jot down the rest of the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the left. You got it? Let's get started. So we left off, we noted that there was resistance to Anglo encroachment once again, this time in the West. We talked about the end that these large, agribusiness, farming, mining, ranching have come in and began to take over the land that had previously been inhabited by both Hispanos and Native Americans. We talked about the Las Cortes Blancas as Hispano resistance. But of course, the largest numerical group of people who were there were Native Americans. So besides the Hispano inhabitants, there were, of course, other people who lived there previously, Native Americans. Remember? Yeah. Remember them? And of course, part of the groups that live there have been pushed there by Americans in past issues, such as the Trail of Tears and the Removal Act in the 1830s. Remember, they're all been pushed out west. And so post-Civil War, we begin to see a lot of Native American conflict. Now, of course, as we talked about, westward expansion was one of those big issues that brought on the Civil War. Would a territory be a slave or free area? After the Civil War, this vast land out west began to open up, enforce a quote-unquote last stand for Native Americans. And this story for the second half of this lecture is the story of escalating tensions. Now, during the first half of U.S. history, the Native American population started around 10 million people at contact. By the time we get to the 1860s, 1870s, we are now down to about 350,000 Native Americans. Yeah, you heard that right. We went from 10 million Native Americans in, say, 1492, 1500. In fact, in the United States, 1607. 10 million in, say, 1600. To the point where 1860, some 260 years later, we're now down to just 350,000. Now, I want to make this very easy for you, right? This is the United States Native American policy in a nutshell. So America's Indian policy. Step 1, see land they want. Step 2, ask the Indians for the land. Now, if the Indians say yes or will negotiate, fantastic, we stop right there. If the Indians say no, we go on to step 3, take it by force. So step 1, see land we want. Step 2, ask them for it. If they say yes, fantastic. If not, step 3, take it by force. Kick them off their land, kill them, murder them, take the land anyway. And then basically wash, rinse, and repeat. This is our American Indian policy in a nutshell. And then if they are any survivors, we'll put them on reservations. So, the thing is, we didn't just attack them directly. We also used other means. We tried to weaken their resolve through various means, including cutting off their major fuel source. And during the post-bellum period, we see buffalo being slaughtered. In fact, there were actually organized hunts by Anglos, wherein they would just ride by on the train, stick their rifle out the window, and begin shooting at the herds of buffalo. And what's so sad about it was they wouldn't go get the buffalo. They wouldn't eat the buffalo meat. They wouldn't use the buffalo for any purpose but let the rotting carcass lie. Let the birds eat it, the vultures. And of course, anyone who's a hunter knows you don't just go off and start eating dead animals, right? You don't know how long they've been there. It can be diseased. You can't just eat that. This is appalling for a number of reasons. One is just plain animal cruelty. Second of all, you're not utilizing a resource, you're just, exterminating it make it an extinct species. You're wasting it because you're not even using it for anything. But they're doing it for a very specific purpose, to hurt the Native Americans, to weaken them. Why? Because for Native Americans, the buffalo was a sacred animal. And I don't mean this as in they worshipped it, no. But it was an integral part of their culture, their society, and yes, their religion. Because it was used for ceremonial purposes. The meat was good for food. They used the bones to help build the teepees and for ceremony purposes. They used the hides for clothes and for making their teepees in the west to keep them warm in the windy, cold winters. In other words, they used the bones also for utensils and tools. In other words, they used every part of the buffalo when they killed one. It wasn't about killing for sport. It was about utilizing and working with the tools and what nature has given you to survive and thrive. And so the American government and the American populace in general began organizing these massive raids to go and just kill and slaughter buffalo by the thousands. The point where they were basically extinct, just to weaken Native American resistance, because there was now land that Anglos wanted in the West, and they wanted to weaken the Indians before trying to take it, which inevitably led to what we would call warfare. And what we'll see during this period, again, especially in the post-bellum period after the Civil War ends, we see a series of wars once again between Native Americans and the U.S. military. The pattern, again, something like this. See land, ask for it. If they say no, go kill them. Wash, rinse, repeat. And the result of this, removal by force, results in the enormous loss of land for Native Americans during the latter part of the 19th century. Let me give you an example of a couple of these ways that happened. The first one was the Black Hills of South Dakota. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been there before. I have not had the privilege of being there. I have seen it on television recently, though. The Black Hills of South Dakota, that extends all the way in from western South Dakota into Wyoming, this is an area of worthless land. No person wants to be there. In fact, when I've been looking for jobs, I'll be honest, I do not have a desire to live in Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota. I don't want to live there. It's not a place I just want to be. Well, guess what? Back in 1868, no one wanted to be there either. Except for Native Americans, that is. It was considered worthless to white settlers to the point where the train went by, and while the train was a nuisance to Native Americans, it wasn't a big deal. But this land was sacred to Native Americans, specifically the Sioux tribe. And the Sioux had had a deal with the U.S. government, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, that the U.S. government guaranteed the Sioux to control this entire region, including the mountain range you see pictured there. But everything begins to change by the 1870s. Why? Well, two reasons. Number one, gold. In the 1870s, gold is discovered in the Black Hills of South Dakota, and now it becomes a region that whites want. So remember our process: see land you want, ask them for it. If they say yes, great. If not, take it by force. And so, in about the 1870s, the U.S. whites have seen land they want because gold is discovered there. So they ask the Indians for it, and the Indians say, no. Why? Because they have a treaty, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, says it's our land. And so, in the 1870s, specifically 1874 is when it really begins, the U.S. government sends in a Civil War hero general by the name of George Armstrong Custer. Now, General Custer was a West Point graduate. He was a well-respected commander during the Civil War, in part because of his fighting near Appomattox when eventually the South surrendered. And therefore, it was thought he would be a great leader to fight against the Native Americans out west. So he's dispatched by the West, theoretically, initially, just to protect the railroad survey, so the railroad companies, protect them from raiding Sioux parties. Now, he leads his expedition to the Black Hills to prevent raids, and gold is discovered. Which, of course, thousands of people begin pouring into the Black Hills, thousands of whites, that is. And this, of course, angers the Sioux, leading to small skirmishes. So by 1874, tensions are high. And again, this is a similar process we've seen back. If you took the first half of U.S. history, you recognize this. We have a treaty. Fantastic. We're going to break that treaty now. And so this escalates tension and violence on both sides. Now, the leader here for Native Americans, he's not the only leader, but he emerged as one of the main leaders, named by the name of Crazy Horse, pictured on the right. And he's a well-respected war leader of the Oglala Sioux Indians in the late 19th century. Now, after years of one-sided arrangements from the American military, increasing violence and being pressured by these gold-crazed white settlers, we see an increasing violence and frequency of uprisings. 15 major battles in 15 months. And Crazy Horse began to call for unity among Native Americans. He began to call for an increasingly unified Native American stand against the increasing harsh realities of the U.S. government. In other words, we're going to make a stand and fight back against the white settlers and fight back against the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government sees what's happening here. It sees the writing on the wall. And so they decide they want to break the will of Native Americans for good. And so they send General Custer to plan a major assault against the main Sioux encampment, a place at Little Bighorn. See the map there. Now, Little Bighorn was a place on the eastern Montana Territory, and in the summer of 1876, Custer decided to send, you see the map there, he's going to send a three-pronged attack. So he's going to take his army, his major military, he's going to divide it into three separate, we'll call it columns, three separate regiments, right? And they're going to each take, two on the right, one down the center. They're going to kind of encircle around the Sioux encampment, Little Bighorn, and they're going to lay out an all-out assault and basically annihilate the Native Americans led by Crazy Horse. It's a pretty good plan. Again, this is a good plan. It makes sense logistically, militarily. There's a few problems, though, with this plan. The first one comes in that one of the three columns, the one led by John Gibbon, I'm sorry, not John. There's John Gibbon's column, there's George Crook's column, and then, of course, there's George Custer's column. So we have John Gibbon, George Crook, and General Custer. Each one of them has a column. The problem is, you can see on the map there, the battle of what's called Rosebud Creek. At Rosebud Creek, in June 17, 1876, George Crook's column is cut off by Crazy Horse. Now, it was not a huge defeat. It was not a huge one-sided loss for either side. But what it does do, it delays George Crook's column. Again, this is June 17th. 1 week later, June 25th, see the date on your screen, is the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And of course, Custer's there with John Gibbon's column. So there's only two columns, and they're waiting for George Crook's column, who's been delayed thanks to Crazy Horse at the Battle of Rosebud Creek. And so Custer here makes some very big, very poor assumptions. He was an arrogant douchebag from people who knew him. He believed he was superior, that he could win easily against Native Americans. But he makes some very poor assumptions. First of all, he believes that he'll be facing hundreds of Native Americans. Despite the fact that Indian scouts were telling him, no, General, no. This is the largest group of Native Americans we've ever seen. But, of course, he ignored the warnings of these Native American scouts and foolishly marched his men, only two columns, because, again, he assumed George Crook's column would be there. But remember, there's no instant messaging, no texting, no cell phone to call him and say, hey, I'm delayed, wait for me. No. And so Custer very arrogantly and incompetently marched the two columns right into Little Bighorn, which, by the way, happens to be in a valley. And these thousands, not hundreds, of Native Americans had the high ground and began to shoot at him. Crazy Horse's troops swarm Custer's column, dealing Custer the worst U.S. defeat to Native Americans in history. Now, I want to clarify, it's only 268 dead, all of Custer's column, by the way, including Custer. It's not the biggest numerical defeat, but it's the most surprising defeat. This was a Civil War hero general. It was not thought he would lose. So while it's not the largest in terms of casualties, it is definitely the most surprising loss to Native Americans in U.S. history. In fact, there have been monuments that have been tried to erect to Crazy Horse because of this tremendous victory for Native Americans. In fact, they began this monument at Little Bighorn in 1948, and still to the present day, it's still not been completed because the U.S. government will not agree to help fund this. It is strictly done through Indian donations. Now, after this, the U.S. government tries, maybe we should try a different tactic, at least elsewhere. So they're going to pull back from the Black Hills for a little bit. Don't worry, we'll come back there in a minute. But down south, they try a different tactic rather than just all-out war. So in 1887, they try a different tactic. This time, it became known as land redistribution. Now, last time we saw Indians in Oklahoma. Of course, we were talking about, in the first half of U.S. history, the Indian Removal Act of 1830s, the Trail of Tears, and of course, these Indian reservations west of the Mississippi, modern-day Oklahoma. Well, while in the northern plains region, the way to weaken the tribes was kill the buffalo. In Oklahoma, the way to weaken the tribes and Indian resistance was through an act known as the Dawes Severalty Act, or just the Dawes Act. And basically, the U.S. government decided, what we're going to do for you Native Americans? We're going to assimilate you and make you one of us. Now, that was a lie. It was a facade. What they really wanted, though, was a new way to steal land from Native Americans and break up the power of the Native American tribe. So what they did was, remember, Native American land was very communal. Everyone worked on it together. They shared each other's benefits. They shared each other's hardships. And they worked together as a communal living space. So in order to break up the power of the tribe and of the chief who's in charge of that communal land, they instead, this Dawes Severalty Act, the Dawes Act, allowed the president to take 160 million acres of land from Native Americans. And this is their land, right? And they were able to redistribute the land into 160-acre plots per Native American family. So you have 160 million acres, and you're going to subdivide that into 160-acre plots of land and give each 160-acre plot to an individual Indian family. Because we love private property, right? We're going to assimilate you as part of the United States. Private property is part of that. So there's a few problems here. The first problem is, this is not the Indian way of life. This is forced assimilation, forced destruction of Native American culture. It also is designed to weaken the chiefdom of a tribe. Because now every family must look out for themselves, not for the greater good of the community, which means what role does the chief have anymore? And third, now I'm no math person, but if you have 160 million acres of land and 160-acre plots, there's going to be land left over. So what do you do with the extra over land? Do you give it to the chiefs? No. You sell the leftover land to white settlers. Again, this is a way to steal land. This was incredibly destructive to Native Americans. It undermined the communal nature, which was the core of tribal life. It forces many Native Americans who had never farmed individually before, they have no money managing experience. Suddenly, they're being told, hey, here's your land. This next year, you have land. You must care for it. You must buy the proper number of tools for it. You must buy the right amount of seed for it. Don't buy too much because then you'll be in debt. Don't make sure you buy enough, though, because otherwise you won't grow enough to sell. And there's no safety net for them. So what happens is these Native Americans who have never had private property, they don't have that business acumen that's needed to understand how much to buy, when to buy, etc. It forces them within a year or two to be in poverty and destitution. And once they, of course, they can't maintain their land, they are forced to sell the land for pennies on the dollar to white settlers, again, land stealing. And if that wasn't enough, if you want to work all this land, you need your family, you need your kids to help you out. But they said, no, this is assimilation, Dawes Act. So they took the kids from Native Americans and sent them into boarding schools. But they didn't send you down. So if you live in Oklahoma, they don't send you from rural Oklahoma to Tulsa or Oklahoma City. No. If you live in Oklahoma, they send you to Chicago, plus someplace in Illinois. They want to remove children as far away from possible from their families to forcibly assimilate and destroy Indian culture. Because once you get to this boarding school, you can no longer speak your Indian language. You boys who are used to having long hair for Native Americans, you must cut it look like a white person, because long hair is an abomination for men, to the Bible. You must dress like a white person, and you're probably never going to see your family again, or if you do, it'll be once or twice, once a year if you're lucky, because you're not going back. And of course, you're being brought up now in an education system that, of course, tells you that Indians are backward, Indians are savage, Indians are bad, and you need to be white, even though they'll never be fully accepted as white. Always the problem. And therefore, it is a decimation of Indian culture and of Indian land. Now, there's a little fun little fact aside here, is that just in July of 2020, the Supreme Court has ruled that indeed this act was illegal and that the land was stolen from Native Americans who were given that land in perpetuity. Now, we haven't found the final result of what's going to transpire with that, but about the eastern half of Oklahoma, according to the Supreme Court, is supposed to be owned by Native Americans. Now, as yet, nothing's happened as of this recording, but something to keep an eye on as we go forward, because the Supreme Court has ruled. Now, we have warfare in the Great Plains. We have the Dawes Act in Oklahoma, the southern region. Children are being stripped away from their families and sent to boarding schools to become white. As their influence and grip on their traditional society diminished, Indians began to search for new ways to cope. Now, you might think alcohol, and partly true. But in response to the push for assimilations, many Indians turned to a spiritual revival known as the ghost dance. And this became a very popular Native American ritual in the 1890s. Now, ultimately, this is technically a synthesis of Christianity and Native American religious rituals. And Jack Wilson, who's a Pawite religious leader, begins to start the ghost dance phenomenon after experiencing a religious vision in 1899. And he begins to see this resurrection of deceased Native Americans and the removal of whites. Now, I don't mean this literally, but this was his vision he had. He began to use the ghost dance as a way to bring Indians together and ultimately restore their culture to fight back against the forced assimilation and decimation from U.S. whites. And they said that if you want to see this become a reality, that the natives reclaim their land, you need to partake part in the ghost dance. Now, of course, the whites saw Indians as being crazy. And while Jack Wilson, again, Native American Jack Wilson, he emphasized nonviolence in this. And of course, this is, again, anathema to whites who see this as being crazy. And what whites see is this is a retaliation. They see this as a building of unity among Native Americans that needs to be snuffed out. Otherwise, the Indians will prepare for war, despite the fact, once again, Jack Wilson, beginner of this, who's credited as beginning the ghost dance, preached nonviolence. Why does this matter? Well, the ghost dance is going to play a major role in the actual last stand for Native Americans in the Great Plains. Because while the Dawes Act did work, if you were a white person, it did work. Back in the North, the U.S. began to go back to the more questionable tactics. But this time, when they made, remember, the U.S. would suffer defeat at Battle of the Bighorn, Custer's last stand. The Native Americans are energized thanks to their victory over Custer and through this ghost dance. These things have energized Native Americans to fight back against white settlers. And the new leader had emerged in the 1890s, and his name was Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull seemed to be the de facto leader of these Native Americans in this region. And he was seen as a symbol, an icon, a rallying point for Native Americans. But he was also well respected by U.S. whites. He was a celebrity because he, as a Native American, had participated in what you see on the far right over here. This man right here is Buffalo Bill Cody. Now, he was a very famous cowboy. And what he had was it was called Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show. Think of it as like a traveling circus, other than they don't have, trapeze artists, they don't have jugglers. Instead, they put on what's called a Wild West show. Wrangling, shootouts. These are all mock. And Sitting Bull, as a Native American, participated in these and became a national celebrity. Well, he is considered then a major Native American leader by the U.S. government. And as the ghost dance is taking off, he becomes a target of the U.S. government because they see the ghost dance as being a threat because the Native Americans may unify under the ghost dance and under Sitting Bull. And so in 1890, the U.S. government sends James McLaughlin. Now, James McLaughlin is an Indian agent. Now, an Indian agent is a person authorized by the U.S. government to interact with Native tribes. Now, in 1890, he was sent to arrest Sitting Bull. Why? Because Sitting Bull was considered a leader of the Sioux people, and because there was a rumor that he was going to lead the Sioux off their reservation. So he's going to lead the men off their land and join with other Native American groups under the auspices of the ghost dance to fight against the whites. And so this was seen as a major threat to U.S. sovereignty and a threat that might cause a war. And so on December 15th, 1890, at 5:30 in the morning, James McLaughlin is sent to Standing Rock Reservation. Now, McLaughlin, you can see how old Sitting Bull looks. How many officers do you think, how many men should he take with him, McLaughlin take, to arrest this old Native American? 10? 20? He took 39 officers and 4 volunteers to arrest one man. Again, he's expecting trouble. So in 5:30 in the morning on December 15th, 1890, they surround the house of Sitting Bull. And they order him outside very quietly and claim he's under arrest. Now, they're trying to do this very quietly. They don't want to start trouble with the Native Americans in the tribal community. But smartly, Sitting Bull makes a little ruckus, makes sure that everyone knows what's going on. And by this point, the Sioux camp is awake and everyone crowds around. Sitting Bull refuses to be arrested for, again, what reason was he being arrested for? And there's a small little scuffle as they try to forcibly arrest Sitting Bull, which of course enrages the Sioux. Now, there's a Sioux man known as Catch the Bear. Now, this Sioux man, Catch the Bear, he had shouldered his rifle. And when he did, it went off. Again, no one was hurt when the shot went off, but the gun went off. And when the gun went off, one of the arresting officers took his revolver and shot back. He didn't shoot Catch the Bear. He shot Sitting Bull in the chest. Another officer took out his revolver and shot Sitting Bull in the head. And the chief dropped to the ground. So remember, a Native American had his rifle, it went off. No one was hurt. Immediately, 2 officers pull out their revolvers and shoot Sitting Bull, one to the chest, one to the head, killing Sitting Bull. A few more people get shot in the process. Ultimately, Sitting Bull and 7 other Native Americans are dead, along with 8 police officers. And of course, all this does is raise tensions. This is not the end of the story. See, now that Sitting Bull's dead, we need a new leader. Now, his half-brother, who's known as Bigfoot. Now, I want you to know Bigfoot was a very derisive name given to him by U.S. whites. His original name was Spotted Elk. Now, Spotted Elk was a half-brother of Sitting Bull, and he was renowned for his skills of negotiation. He's not a war-type chief. He's a negotiator. Doesn't like war. He's not a warrior tactician or military tactician. He's a negotiator. He and his people were heavily involved in this ghost dance phenomenon. And after Sitting Bull's death, he assumes the leadership. So he decides that what he needs to do is leave. Because staying there, they're all going to die. He knows this. So he wants to negotiate from a place of strength, to meet up with other Native Americans, other Sioux and Lakotas, as a means to negotiate peace. And so he attempts to flee with his people to the Badlands. Now, this is a peaceful expedition. In fact, he flew a white flag. Spotted Elk did. And again, knowing a white flag means we come in peace. We're not any warfare here. We're going in peace. Of course, U.S. whites don't believe this. They think he's going for war. They don't want to admit what he's doing. And so on December 29th, just 2 weeks after the death of Sitting Bull, 1890, the 7th Cavalry intercepts Spotted Elk's party. And Spotted Elk says, oh, we don't want to fight. He actually was sick at the time, Spotted Elk was. He had caught pneumonia. Did not want to fight. He wants to negotiate peace. Doesn't want to see his people slaughtered. And so Spotted Elk surrenders peacefully. They are escorted to a site near Wounded Knee, a place called Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota, set up camp. Shortly after the arrival, though, in this camp to rest for the night, the U.S. soldiers enter the camp and demand the Indians give up all their rifles. Now, a Sioux medicine man begins to dance the ghost dance, urging the Sioux to defy the soldiers' orders. Now remember, Spotted Elk has surrendered. They've gone peacefully to this camp, and now these soldiers come in, asking them and ordering them to give up their weapons. This medicine man begins to, again, theoretically stir up trouble for whites by provoking the ghost dance. But remember, the ghost dance was meant to be peaceful. It was not meant to be violent. Well, in the process, you have this chaos now in this camp, right? You have the medicine man dancing, trying to convince other people to do the ghost dance. You have the soldiers demanding these Indians give up their rifles. And then you get to a deaf Indian by the name of Black Coyote. Yeah, you're there. He's a deaf Indian. He does not hear the order to give up his rifle. And when the soldiers reach for it to take it from him, he refuses because he says, no, this is my gun. I bought it. I paid for it. It's my property. And of course, the soldiers proceed to try to grab it from him. And when they do, the gun goes off. Now, Black Coyote was not trying to do anything wrong here. Again, he was deaf, did not hear Spotted Elk say, give up your guns. He did not necessarily know what was going on with the soldiers taking his guns. He just wanted to maintain his property. And when his gun is accidentally triggered, it initiates a massacre. Because on the hills around the camp and surrounding the camp were these new style machine guns known as the Hotchkiss guns. These are essentially machine guns. Now they're early machine guns, and they often got jammed up, but not this day. On this day, these rapid fire guns began shooting as soon as Black Coyote's gun went off accidentally. By this point, most Native Americans are unarmed. Remember, they've already given up their guns. They killed all the Sioux and Lakota who were in the camp. And then they went to chase down any Sioux that had tried to escape the fire. More than 150 Native Americans were killed in what is known as the Battle at Wounded Knee, or more traditionally known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. As the white soldiers gunned down unarmed Native Americans and chased down any that tried to escape. Again, this was December 29th, 1890. In 1890, the U.S. declared the frontier closed. And the last battle of the American Indian Wars signified the closing of the frontier, i.e., Wounded Knee being the most well-known. But there were other reasons as well that this becomes the close of the frontier. Yes, it was the last stand of Native Americans. But other reasons as well. Farmers and ranchers, they were fencing off their property. The slaughter of the buffalo. But either way, no matter how you look at the close of the frontier, what 1890 represents is the end of a protracted genocide of Native American peoples that had started as soon as Europeans arrived on the East Coast in Jamestown, 1607. Native American tribes would increasingly be forced onto smaller and smaller reservations. The U.S. government initiated more boarding schools for Native Americans to attempt to Americanize them. But all it did was just further isolate young Native Americans from their families and breed discontent and resentment. So what are the legacies of this? Well, here is Native American culture in the 1500s prior to contact. Here it is by 1890. You see all this smaller, the battles, but you also see the smaller reservations. In fact, to the present day, 7 of the top 10 poorest counties in our country, 7 of the top 10 poorest counties in our country are Indian reservations. Indian reservations represent some of the most impoverished areas in our nation. Watch this. I watched it a couple times. See the loss of Native American land from 1800 through 1890. Watch this. So we already have 13 colonies, but starting in 1800, the loss of Native American land to the point where 1890, all we have left is small reservations. There's one more legacy besides the closing the frontier. Remember that fourth key term I talked about? The closing of the frontier was significant because it signaled a shift away from the expanding America into the frontier and toward industrialization we'll talk about in the next lecture. But one more important legacy, and that is the myth of the cowboy. Why do I say that? Because the myth of the cowboy as this quote-unquote true American hero, an American icon, they were valorized as a hero of the West. They were able to tame the Wild West, save it from savage lawlessness of brigands, bandits, Native Americans, Mexicans, Asians. Think about every movie you ever see, any Western. It's always cowboys are the heroes. When you're a kid, you played cowboys and Indians. Of course, the hero is the cowboy. The Indian's always the bad guy. The problem with this is it sets up a mentality that says, well, whites are superior, they're civilized, Native Americans are savage, they're backwards, they're the enemy. But it also cements this cultural phenomenon known as rugged individualism. Think about it. A cowboy was this rugged hero, right? The cowboy was a rugged individual loner who took the law into his own hands, couldn't be told by anyone else, the government, how to do their job. They were there to tame it and do their job, and they will win it no matter what the cost, and they will be the hero as a result. The problem with this rugged individualism is that it creates this mental idea, this cultural phenomenon, societal expectation that people only look out for themselves. And of course, it plays very well with our next lecture, which is about the American dream, the self-made man. And of course, it plays well in modern day debates. And of course, 2020, we're going through the pandemic known as coronavirus or COVID-19. Of course, there's a huge debate over individual rights, over can the government tell individuals to quarantine? Can they tell them, hey, you need to stay home for a while? Can they tell them to wear a mask? And of course, the usual response is, by many people, is that the government can't tell me that because we are individuals, we have individual rights. But that idea is born in old iconography, old ideas of rugged individualism. And this idea of rugged individualism goes back to, again, colonization days, where you had people coming over to make their way in the world. Remember, independent competency of the Puritans, right? It filters with the cowboy era moving out west of the frontier. It'll filter in the 1920s, 1930s, when we want to roll back regulations and restore the rugged individualism of, well, Americans. And it plays very well in the modern day with those who do not want to wear masks or feel the government should not be able to tell them to wear a mask. Because whether it's the cowboy of the 1800s, whether it is those in the 1920s, whether it's the people who do not want masks today, they're against it because they cite an overreach of government and freedom of individuality. Remember, for themselves. So this is a legacy of westward expansion, the idea of a cowboy. Now, ultimately, the frontier signified what it meant to be an American to many. For many years, especially due to the idea of manifest destiny, it became a justification to move west. But now America needed to find new ideals and new markets. And we will begin to look beyond these borders in the next coming years. But until then, until next time, take care and bye-bye.